one thing that we did in our small group the last couple of weeks, we've been talking in our small group on Sunday nights about kind of who we are as a group and whether or not small group is something you do or is a small group something you are, you know? I mean, and they're really two different things. Because if small group is just something you do, then by all means, we got to start on time, we got to end on time, we got to complete, we got to check the box, we got to go through the lesson plan, we got to do something with those kids and put them in another room so we can do our small group. We can call them back in when we're done doing our small group. But in our group, we've just sort of decided that that's not the way we're going to approach it, because for us, we've decided small group isn't something we do as much as our small group is something we are. And so our approach to doing Sunday nights is going to be a little bit different for our group than it is for a lot of groups. And part of that conversation involved, okay, what do we value as a group? Like, what's deep down inside us, in our core being? What are our values? And then we'll decide to do things that reflect what we value. One of the things that came up was serving people. A lot of people in my small group value serving people, which is a foreign concept for me. I'll just be really sort of open and authentic with you. It never occurs to me to serve people. I'm not like a mean-spirited person. It just never occurs to me to do stuff. And yet for my wife, for example, my wife loves to serve people, especially people who are sort of marginalized in our society. Aliens, widows, orphans, speakers of other language, refugees from other countries. My wife is drawn to those people. And so we've decided as a group over the course of the next year, we're going to seek out opportunities to do that. And I was having a conversation with another member in a small group Monday night. We were getting together, we watched the football game together, and we were talking about this. And he said, well, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, I don't want to do it either. And he said, it's outside of my comfort zone, and I'll tell you what's going to happen. We're going to schedule something, and I'm going to make every excuse I can think of, and I'm going to avoid it, and I'm going to try to get out of it, and I'm going to go and do it anyway, and I'm going to complain the whole way there, and once I get there, I'm going to love it. And that's kind of how I feel about tonight's message, because I have dragged my feet to get here tonight. But once we get into it, I know we're going to feel good about this. It's going to be painful. It's going to be convicting. It's going to be outside of our comfort zone. But if we'll allow God to just sort of do that surgery that He does, I bet we're going to feel better after we're done. Okay, so with all that, we're going to launch into this. We've been in this series, and we're kind of discovering that Jesus came to do more than just sort of get us off the hook for eternity. He came to do more than just get us into heaven when we die. He came to bring us a certain kind of life, and the life that He brought us is available to each and every person, and it is the life you have always dreamed of being able to live. And He comes and He says that life that is beyond your wildest dreams is available to you. The question is, how bad do you want it? How badly do you want to live this kind of life? How badly do you want to be free? How badly do you want to live this lifestyle of courageous, fearless security? How badly do you want it? Because it may involve paying a price. So He compares the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God to a man who finds a treasure buried in a field. You know this story. It's in Matthew 13. This guy stumbles over a treasure that's buried in a field, and he goes and he sells everything he owns so that he can buy this field because the treasure is worth more than he currently has. Or, he says later in the same chapter, it's like a guy who goes out looking for pearls, and he finds this one pearl in particular that is a pearl of great price. And he is willing to sacrifice anything he has to in order to gain this pearl, because he knows that once he has this pearl, it'll be far more valuable than anything else he would have to give up in order to get it. Or one time a guy comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, what do I have to do in order to be one of your followers? And Jesus says, well, you got to keep the commandments. And the guy says, well, I already do all that. Is there anything else? And Jesus looked at him and He kind of discerned what was going on in this guy's heart. And He says, here's what you need to do. You need to go and you need to sell everything. Give it away. Give it away to the poor. And then come back and follow me. And the guy went away sad, because he knew he couldn't do it, because he had so much stuff. And what he thought he possessed actually turned out possessed him. And so Jesus uses these kind of stories to tell us that, listen, that life that you've always wanted really is available to you. How bad do you want it? Do you want it badly enough that if you had to, I'm not saying you have to, but if you had to, would you be willing to give up everything in order to pursue this one thing? There's a guy who's a preacher who was telling a story once about how he grew up like a lot of us did, who we all, not all of us, but some of us kind of grew up believing that the Holy Spirit like wrote a book and then retired and was, lives on the beach now. Like after Acts 28, he just resigned and left and doesn't do much anymore. I mean, some of us, we sort of grew up with that kind of idea that the Holy Spirit doesn't do anything anymore. And once this guy sort of realized, wow, the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible actually teaches that God is still alive and still living and still active and still wants to do stuff in our world. He went on a quest to kind of learn more about how God continues to act in our world. And it led him to all kinds of, places. And he went one place, it was just one of those crazy Pentecostal sort of, jump up and down and people falling over and speaking in tongues kind of places. And he was sitting in the back looking at all this stuff, and he thought, oh, God, do I have to do that? Like if I'm going to be wide open and say, okay, God, whatever you want to do it, are you going to make me do that? And this is what he really sort of sensed God saying to him in that moment. No, I'm not going to make you do that. But would you be willing to if I asked you? I mean, would you be willing to look foolish if I asked you to do that? Would you, or would your pride still kind of stand in your way? Okay, so that's kind of what I'm asking you to think through tonight. Would you be willing to do something crazy if you thought that your possessions were standing between you and intimacy with God? I mean, if Jesus came to you like he came to the rich young ruler and said, here's what you need to do. You need to sell everything. You need to give your money to the poor because your money is standing between you and me. Would you be willing to? I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not suggesting that that's what God's telling you tonight. I'm asking you to look deep down in your heart and say, would you be willing to do that? Robert Wuthnow is a sociologist at Princeton University, and he specializes in sort of religious sociology, religious behavior in America. And he's written a number of books. One of the books that he wrote came out in 1998. It was called God and Mammon in America. And I apologize for not having a PowerPoint. That was part of the thing that I cheated on today. God and Mammon in America in 1998. And one of the things he found out was, in 1998, he surveyed thousands of people all around the country, and 86% of the people he surveyed agreed that greed is bad. I mean, there was a time in America where maybe they wouldn't have said that. Maybe in the 1980s, when Oliver Stone puts out his movie Wall Street, and Michael Douglas wins an Academy Award for basically a monologue that starts with this phrase, greed is good. And there was a time in America where that was really sort of the mantra, and that's pretty much gone away. And by 1998, 86% of Americans surveyed agreed. Greed is a bad thing. Greed is a sin. Many of them would even go so far as to say that. Greed is bad. Greed is a sin. Greed is not something I want to be associated with. Now, what's interesting is he also said, okay, if you could choose of these four things, which would you choose? And he gave them, I think it was a longer life, better sex life, health, and a lot more money. Which would you choose? And 82% of the very same people who just said that greed is a sin said, I would choose a lot more money. And so the phrase that he came up with was, basically, people in America believe this: I'm not greedy, I just want a lot more money. Now, is it me, or is there a serious disconnect there? I'm not greedy, I just want a lot more money. Interestingly enough, 16% of the people who he surveyed, who were Christians, by the way, said that wanting a lot more money is wrong. Only 16% said wanting a lot more money is wrong, but they all agreed that greed was bad. So I guess, what is greed? I'm not really sure. If greed isn't, I want a lot more money, then what is greed? Jesus has a lot to say about this, and some of the things that he says are just downright disturbing. He says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He says, woe to you who are rich. He says, take heed and beware of all covetousness. This is hard stuff. There are about 500 verses in the Bible that deal with prayer. There are a little less than 500 verses in the Bible that deal with faith. There are 2,300 verses in the Bible that deal with money. Some theologians estimate that about 10% of the New Testament deals directly with money. Jesus told about 40 parables or stories during his life on earth. 40 parables, 16 of them have to do directly with money. Now, I was talking with somebody about this, and they said, well, John, you don't strike me as a greedy person. In fact, I would characterize you as being an extremely generous person. And the truth about me, I don't think that I am a very greedy person. But then again, who does? Who's going to say, that's me, greed, that's my problem? Greed, no, I don't know anybody who's going to say, my biggest problem. Like if you're in an interview, you know when you go for a job interview and they always ask you that, what's your biggest weakness? Anybody say, I'm just a greedy son of a gun? Does anybody say that? I don't know anybody who says, my biggest problem is I just can't get enough. Take. That's me all day long. Nobody says that. Nobody's willing to say I'm greedy. But here's how I tend to think about it, okay? In this part of the country, 200 years ago, a lot of people owned slaves. Now, we know from historical records that not many people owned a lot of slaves. Most of the people who did own slaves just owned very few. And most of the people who owned slaves were pretty nice to the slaves that they had. But they still had slaves. And they could rationalize it in a lot of different ways. Well, I read the Bible. I was a Christian. I went to church. I went to church with other people who read the Bible and were Christians. And we all owned slaves. Everybody did it. And one day they're going to have a conversation with God. And God's going to say, how could you do that? How could you own another person, buy and sell human beings created in my image and keep them in chains? I don't care if you were nice to them. You bought and sold people. How could you do that? They're going to have that conversation with God. And what are they going to say? Well, other people did it. We weren't as bad as them. I don't think that argument is going to carry much weight with God. You know why I think that? Because would that argument carry any weight with your mom? Well, other people were doing it and we weren't as bad as them. What does your mom say when you used to say that? Well, other people were doing it. Well, if they jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? That's what moms tend to say. And if it won't carry any weight with mom, I'm going to suggest that it's not going to carry any weight with God, okay? So people, and I'm not saying that they're disqualified from getting into heaven or anything like that, but they're going to have that uncomfortable conversation with God where they're going to have to answer for that. And this is what really concerns me in our society. And for me personally, that one day I'm going to have a similar conversation with God about my money. And God's going to say, do you realize that 1 billion people are going to bed tonight hungry? That between 30,000 and 40,000 people died today of starvation. That there are people who don't have drinkable water, who don't have basic sanitation needs, people who can't read, and the truth about me is, I ate more than I needed to yesterday. And what am I going to say? Well, it's not like I live in a McMansion. I don't live in a 5,000 square foot house, and I don't drive a Rolls Royce or something like that. There are other people around me who are Christians, and they read their Bibles, and they do it too, and they're worse than I am. Is that going to carry any weight with God? So on the one hand, I think I'm not a real greedy person. But then on the other hand, I have to ask myself, at what point in time do I hear Jesus' words to rich people? See, my tendency is to say, yeah, you rich people out there, look out, because Jesus is coming for you. At what point in time do I realize that the rich people out there include the rich people in here? And the truth is, most of us, maybe we need to define rich. Maybe that's part of our problem, because most of us live better than kings lived up until 200 years ago. Most of us have any of you got your winter clothes out of storage yet? Does it seem bizarre that we have so many clothes that we can actually put some of them in storage we have seasonal clothing? Can you imagine some of the people who live in other parts of the world, if we told them we have seasonal clothes, we have clothes that we don't even wear 9 months out of the year? How bizarre that must sound to them? I wonder, what will God say to me about this? And I wonder, what will I say to him? Because here's the way Jesus phrased it. He said, listen, whatever you do to the least of these, it is as if you did it to me. And I have a theory. There are churches everywhere. I visit a lot of churches every year. I've been in about 40 churches a year for the last almost 4 years now, doing consulting and doing speaking in different places. And most churches say they are committed to reaching lost people. I haven't yet found the church that says, lost people, forget them, we're all about us. They won't say that out loud, at least. Every one of them says we are committed, deeply committed to reaching lost people. But the same question applies to them. How bad do you want it? How badly do you want it? I got an email from a guy who works at a church. This is actually from an email that I got from a guy who works at a church. And this guy asked me to help him figure out some things with his church. He said, there seems to be a disconnect. Don't seem to be firing on all cylinders at our church. What seems to be the problem? And I made some suggestions that I think, were pretty rational and sane. Same kind of suggestions I make to churches all over the place. And it would involve changing the way they do some things. But this was part of his response to me. He said, the fact is, we are and will likely be a church that always identifies strongly with our heritage. And as such, we will have some difficulty having the broader appeal and explosive growth that many churches experience. Let me read that again. The fact is, we are and will likely be a church that always identifies strongly with our heritage. And as such, we will have some difficulty having the broader appeal and explosive growth that many churches experience. Do you know what he's saying? We don't want to grow. We don't want to reach lost people if it means changing the way we do things, because we're more committed to ourselves. So we say, oh yeah, we're all about reaching lost people, but we're not. That looks good on the letterhead, that looks good on the mission statement, but push comes to shove, we're not willing to, we're more committed to our tradition and our heritage than we are to people who are going to die and face a Christless eternity, because we don't want to ruffle feathers, we don't want to rock the boat, we don't want to change anything. We want it to be easy. We want reaching lost people to be easy. How badly do you want it? The truth about that church, and I know that church really, really well, and I love that church, and it breaks my heart. They don't want it. They don't want to really do what God's called them to do. How does a church experience explosive growth? For a church to experience explosive growth, they have to want it badly enough to tear down some things that have been built up and to build up some other things that have been torn down. And in order to do that, it's going to take money, you see. And they know, ooh, if we start moving things around and changing things up too much, we might lose some people. And we're more concerned with keeping the people we have than reaching the people who are out there. And this is going to require a lot of things. Think about this. 1/4 of Americans claim to have had some sort of born-again experience. Okay, now the population just hit 300 million, right? This week, at some point in time, we sort of silently crossed the barrier into 300 million in American population. Now, 1/4 of 300 million is 75 million, okay? Now, if 75 million people who claim to have had some sort of born-again experience, can you imagine what would happen If those 75 million Americans decided, we're going to start viewing lost people the way Jesus viewed lost people. And we're going to start viewing poor people the way Jesus viewed poor people. We're going to start viewing money the way Jesus viewed money, and we're going to start living financially the way Jesus would live if he had access to our resources. Can you imagine what would happen? See, I don't think the barrier to reaching lost people is that we just need to have, better programming or more training or, tracts or, door knocking campaigns or whatever. I don't think that's, but I do think that if they saw us get off our big fat wallets and go out there and actually do something to change the plight of poor people, of widows, of orphans, of people dying in Africa, of people dying in our own streets. What if 75 million people decided, I'm going to look for somebody today that I can help? I've got financial margin enough that I could probably make sure somebody eats today who wouldn't ordinarily eat. What if 75 million of us decided that's what we were going to do? My daughter recently had her birthday. Annabelle just turned 7 a couple of weeks ago, and she got some money for her birthday, and she got cash. Somebody gave her some cash, and I went up to her room the night after she'd received this gift, and she had 3 piles of cash on her bed. And I said, what are you doing here? She said, well, this is my spend money, this is my save money, and this is my give money. And Daddy, do you think it would be okay if I took $5 out of my spend money and put it in my give money? What if 75 million grown-ups who are supposed to be more mature than a 7-year-old had 3 piles at their house and periodically asked themselves, would it be okay if we took some out of our spend pile and put it in our give pile? Maybe we'd really be salt and light. Maybe we'd become that kind of community that God has always dreamed of. We are responsible to God for how we spend our money. And the big problem in a lot of churches, and this church is no exception to it, is that we talk an awful lot about stuff and we don't do much about it. And we kind of get addicted to feeling convicted, especially people who have lots of money. People who have a fair amount of money, we like to feel guilty every once in a while about it. Because then we can say, well, yeah, I have a lot of money, but I don't feel good about it. So we like that a little bit. We kind of get addicted to conviction, but we never really do something about it. We never really change. And so it becomes a lot of talk with very little action. So the question is, all right, would you be willing to just consider giving some of your stuff away? Because most of the people in this room have more stuff than you can use. But most of the people in this world don't have enough. Do you have to do this? No. But would you be willing to? That's all I'm asking. I mean, if it ever became clear that the one thing standing between you and real intimacy with God was your stuff, would you give it away? And then here's a follow-up question. What would it take to convince you of that? And now is the time when the speaker really moves in for the kill and really sort of puts a thumb screws to you and makes you feel guilty. And I'm not going to do that. You can do that on your own. Here's what I'm going to do. Let's open up the Bible and we'll see what Jesus has to say in Matthew chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 24 and then we're going to work back up to the top of this paragraph. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Man, it got quiet in here. And hot. Okay. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Jesus says this really plainly. He says, no one can serve 2 masters. Now, before I go any further, let me ask you this. If I were to say there are 2 forces in the world at work who are vying for your undivided loyalty, 2 great forces in the world. One is God, and God wants your undivided attention and your loyalty. And the other force is, what do you think the other force is? Right. What does Jesus say? Jesus says it's not Satan necessarily, although Satan may be standing behind this, but he says no one can serve 2 masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. He says money's the other force in the world vying for your attention. You've got to choose. It's going to be one or the other. Now back up to verse 19. We'll take a run at this. He says, okay, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Now, what he's really getting at here is asking this question. What is your primary pursuit? You cannot have two ultimate goals. You just can't. One will eventually win out over the other. And so Jesus is saying here, it would be really, really foolish for you to make your ultimate pursuit about stuff, because stuff in this world is vulnerable. Stuff is prone to decay. I just asked if any of you have gotten your winter clothes out of storage. We got ours out of storage last week right before it turned really cold, or not really cold, but it turned cold enough to wear a sweater, you know. And my favorite sweater, my sister gave me a sweater a couple of years ago at Christmas. And it's beautiful. It's great charcoal gray, Banana Republic, V-neck, very hip, very trendy, very metro, very whatever, you know. It looks great with, you know, and it has a big hole right here. Big hole right there. Not in the back or somewhere on the side or somewhere where you can, but just right there. And it's not like a tear where you could maybe kind of underneath you could stitch or something. It's a big, somehow a moth got in the attic and ate a big chunk out of my sweater. And I looked at that and I was so aggravated because it's my favorite sweater. And it's a hassle. I mean, it's a really big hassle. But I thought two things about that. You know, first of all, it wouldn't happen if I wore that sweater more often. I mean, because you never like are wearing clothes, and moths don't generally attack the clothes that you're wearing. You know, it's the fact that it sat in storage for who knows how long. That's how moths were able to get in there and eat all that, you know, big thing. If I wore it more often, if I used it more often, that's what Jesus is saying. It's not bad to have a sweater from Banana Republic. It's just we have so much stuff that it's just laying around for months at a time. If we put it to use, then moths and rust doesn't jump up on a moving, you know, a tool that's in use does not tend to rust. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's when it's laying around and inactive that it becomes susceptible to moth and rust. So the first thing I thought was that wouldn't happen if I wore it more often. The second thing I thought was it's aggravating, but it's not the end of my world. Because my ultimate pursuit is not to have the complete collection of Banana Republic sweaters. There are people for whom that seems to be like the ultimate goal, is to have all the, you know, Manola Blanc shoes, or to have all of the, you know, there are people for whom that is the ultimate goal in life. And for me, that's just not the case. So, it's aggravating, but it's not the end of my world. Now Jesus moves on to talk about rust, okay? And when we think of something rusting, we either think of tools, or if we lived in a colder climate, and some of you who lived, like you lived in Detroit for all those years, you know when something rusts, people tend to think of cars, okay? In my family, that would be, we have two vehicles in my family. We have one nice vehicle, and Jill drives that one, and then we have one just jalopy beater, get from point A to point B sometimes kind of car. And that's the one that I tend to drive. My wife and kids are not here tonight, so I got to drive the nice van, so I felt good about that. But I drive a Dodge Caravan with 144,000 miles on it. And the top has begun to rust. So it's just a matter of time, and it's going to drop its transmission at any moment. I just know. It's sitting in the driveway. It's just going to drop its transmission. Now, contrast that with, I got online today, I found out the fastest car with the most horsepower is also the most expensive car in the world. There is one in Atlanta. It's a Bugatti Veyron. Volkswagen makes it. Listen to some of the specs on this car. It's been clocked at 240 miles an hour, 1,000 horsepower, 16 cylinders. It goes 0 to 60 in less than 3 seconds. It puts out twice as much horsepower as a Dodge Viper. Any of you have ever driven a Dodge Viper? Think about that times 2, okay? The Bugatti Veyron, and it costs $1.2 million. And there's one in Atlanta. Some guy who used to own a chewing gum company, Double Bubble. The guy who owned Double Bubble owns one. And this is what I thought about the Bugatti Veyron. 400 years from now, it's going to be a pile of rust. That's what Jesus says, right? I mean, 400 years from now, it's going to be a pile of rust. And so I like to think of myself not as driving a green Dodge minivan, but as driving a Bugatti Veyron just 400 years before it turns into the pile of rust. My green minivan has 144,000 miles. My green minivan goes 0 to 60. My green minivan wouldn't do 240 miles an hour if you push it off the top of a building. And 400 years from now, it's going to look an awful lot like a Bugatti Veyron. They're just going to be two big piles of rust next to each other. That's it. People are eternal. Our cars are piles of rust waiting to happen. And 400 years from now, how much status are you going to be able to wring out of your pile of rust? I mean, are you going to go, yeah, but that's Lexus rust there. I mean, that's a whole different quality of rust than Hyundai rust, you know? Stuff is vulnerable. It's predisposed to wear out. Jesus says, don't build your life on that. That's foolish. That's dumb. That doesn't make any sense. Now look at verse 20. He says, but instead of doing that, here's what you do. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Okay, let's talk about this for a little bit, because we tend to think of heaven as some faraway place that you go to when you die in the sky by and by. And so the idea of storing up treasures there seems strange to us. But we've already seen that when Jesus talks about heaven, he may be talking about something that's like, it's like in The Princess Bride. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means, you know? Jesus talks about heaven. So for example, in Matthew chapter 4, he says, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. Well, is he saying stop sinning so you can go to heaven when you die? That doesn't seem to be what he's saying. When he says in Matthew 7, or in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's teaching people how to pray, he says, our Father in heaven. Is he talking about our Father who is far, far away in a place we'll only have access to when we die? God's not that far away. God is here with us, right? God is as close to us as the air we breathe. You could reach out and touch the kingdom of heaven right now. So, okay, I grew up singing a song. It's still in the hymnal. It's song number 881, and it's called Mansions Over a Hilltop. Do you guys remember this song? Oh, I just knocked the microphone there with it. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below. A cottage, by the way, means a simple, small house. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. Now, first of all, has anybody looked at the parking lot of this church? Do you know how ridiculous it is to look at that parking lot, to know where you all live, and have you come in here and sing this song with a straight face? That is absolutely ridiculous. You're not satisfied with a cottage below. You live in a 2,500 square foot house. I do too. I can't sing this song with any sense of integrity. You know when I was satisfied with my house is about 2,400 square feet, okay? Which is fairly modest for the neighborhood I live in. Most of the houses we're in one of the smallest houses in our neighborhood, okay? I was satisfied with my house the day I moved in it. And then, because we were in the habit of looking at houses, you know, that weekend, there was an open house in another neighborhood near ours. And we thought, oh, let's go by and check that out. Just kind of see what the other neighborhoods in our area kind of look like, what they're going for. And we walked into a house that was a little bit more expensive than what we paid for ours. And, oh man, they got 12-foot ceilings in here. We only had 9 in ours. You know what? I bet we could refinance our house. And we already started thinking about how we could get into a bigger house. I'm not satisfied with my house, and neither are most of you. Satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver, a little gold. But in that city, where the ransomed will shine. I want a gold one that's silver lined. You want a gold house? How impractical is that? Do you know how hard it would be to clean that thing? You couldn't sit anywhere. It'd be uncomfortable. It'd be awful with silver lining. Now, here's the thing about this, okay? Some people think that the goal then is to do without here. I'm going to do without here so that I can have it in spades when I get up there. So I'm going to drive a terrible car and I'm going to live in a shanty, but boy, when I get to heaven, I'm going to have a gigantic mansion, and then you'll see. And that's not what Jesus is talking about either. God doesn't work like that. When Jesus talks about heaven or the kingdom of heaven, he's talking about something that's available right now. Something that people can just walk into today. And so what does verse 20 mean? Store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. I think it means the same thing. I think this is just another way of saying what he says later in the same chapter in verse 33. Verse 33, he says, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek the kingdom of heaven. Store up treasures in God's kingdom. Seek his kingdom above all else, as if it were a treasure hidden in a field, as if it were the pearl of great price. Sell everything if you have to. Devote yourself to the single-minded pursuit of one thing, living life in God's kingdom. Would you be willing to do that if it meant giving up your pursuit of other stuff? Look at verse 21. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Just to prove this verse, would you play along with me for a moment? Would you do something for me? Just, how many of you have your wallet here? Or your purse or your checkbook or something like that? Take your wallet out. Look at it for a moment. Rub it if you want to. Put it up close to your face. However, you know. When you carry your wallet, it gives you a good sense of security. You ever leave your house without your wallet and you feel naked? Do me a favor. Hand your wallet to the person sitting next to you. We're going to take up the collection now. Anybody feel a little anxious? You know, because the other person might look in there and they might see that if you have cash, or you might open it up and a moth will fly out or something. You know, I mean, you don't know. There may be embarrassing things in your wallet and you don't want the other person to know. One of the things that Robert Wuthnow in his book found, look, some people are actually like right here with their wallet. They're not even going to sit back and relax. Robert Wuthnow found out that people who claim to be Christians actually talk about their finances less than people who aren't Christians. We get really guarded and jaded and weird about our money because it's my money. And we're willing to talk about just about anything else. My marriage is a wreck and my kids don't obey and oh, my life. But don't talk about my money. Look, some people are already exchanging their wallets back because they can't stand the anxiety that it produces in you. Just sit. Let that other person hold your wallet for a second. Does it make you feel vulnerable? It makes you feel... This is the truth. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Tell me, if the person who is holding your wallet right now got up and left the room, what would you do? Why do you think God wants your money? Because when you hand him your wallet, now he's got your attention. He doesn't just have your money, now he's got your attention. And wherever he goes, you're going with him. Go ahead and hand the wallet back. I'll give you a diagnostic question to ask yourself so you can see how well you really are conforming this part of your life to the teachings of Jesus. Okay, here's the diagnostic question I want you to ask yourself. You might want to write this down in your notes. We printed out this note sheet for you and everything. You might want to write this down. It's a real simple question. Am I more generous now than I was this time last year? Am I more generous now than I was this time last year? Because see, life in this world, sort of the conventional wisdom of this world says, as you increase your income, you should also increase the amount of money you spend on yourself. So when you get a raise, You never think, most people never think, oh, now I can finally give more money away. Most people think, now I can increase my standard of living. See, I wrote a book that came out back in April that sold fairly well. And I know in January I'm going to get a royalty check from the sales of that book. And I'm already thinking what I'm going to do with that money. My wife and I have talked about it. Do we get new carpet? We've talked about remodeling the kitchen with it. We've talked about, maybe I'll get a new car or all these kinds of things. Now listen, there's nothing wrong with getting new carpeting, nothing wrong with remodeling your kitchen, nothing wrong with getting a new car, but first things first. Am I seeking God's kingdom first? What would that look like? Have I, in my mind, already sort of divvied that money up into 3 piles or just one? See, conventional wisdom says, no. When you get an increase, you just increase your standard of living. John Wesley wrote a lot of the songs in the hymnal that are better than the one that we just talked about, which is my least favorite song. But John Wesley wrote some good ones in there. And John Wesley had sort of 3 rules of money that he lived by. The first rule, and most of you will appreciate these first 2. It's the third one that kind of trips us up. The first one is earn all you can. Go for it. Some people are really gifted at earning money. If that's you, go for it. Earn as much money as you can. I mean, do it with ethics and with integrity. You don't do anything immoral or illegal, But go ahead. As long as you can do it and honor God, make as much money as you can. And for most of us, we're like, all right, that's good. The second rule that he lived by, save all you can. Ooh, that's kind of a little bit trickier. Okay, save all you can. That means probably living on a budget, living within your means, having some financial margin so you can put some away. So first 2 rules, earn all you can. Second, save all you can. The third one, give all you can. I read an article not too long ago about John Wesley's theory of money, and the guy who wrote the article said that most people who claim to follow Wesley have decided that 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Give all you can. Earning is great, and saving is wise. But you know what? Giving is godly. That's why giving God is so big on you developing a generous spirit and generous heart, because that reflects His heart and His spirit. He's given us so much. He's been so generous to us. When we demonstrate generosity, that's godly. Verse 22. We've got to rush to get through all this. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And that's kind of a confusing word picture here. But Jesus is talking about perception, about the ability to have some clear vision. And I'll just tell you, what happens to me when I'm underprepared is I go long. So I'll just apologize to you right now. We may be a couple of minutes over time, but I'm going to try to wrap this up as close to on time as possible. It's very important that we have clear vision, because you base your actions on your perception of reality. If you see the poor the way many people in our world see the poor, then you will treat them in a certain way. However, if you see the poor the way Jesus saw the poor, then you will treat them differently. Because healthy eyes, Christ-like eyes, are good and filled with generosity and light. And unhealthy eyes are filled with greed and cynicism and envy and darkness. A better way to think about this, or a more clear way of thinking about this, when you are driving, imagine you're driving and you see a police officer pull up next to you. What do you naturally do? Or if you see a police officer behind you, what do you naturally do? Slow down, or at least look at the speedometer, right? I mean, that's what we do. How many of you would be willing to say you drive differently when there's a police officer behind you or somewhere near you? Do you drive differently? Okay, most of us, that's sort of our natural instinct. Now, what if Fulton County decided to assign a police officer to shadow you everywhere you went, all the time? Every time you got in a car, that police officer was there to shadow you. How many of you would say that your driving practices would have to change somewhat, that you would drive differently over the course of the next 24 hours than you did the last 24 hours? Okay, most of us would. Now, here's the question. Do you really believe that God is always with you? See, we sort of affirm that, but let me ask it this way. Suppose God came down in bodily form, like he did when Jesus was here on earth, and he followed you around everywhere you went. How many of you would say you would behave differently if Jesus was actually following you around everywhere you went? Now, let me ask the question again. Do you really believe that God is always with you? You see what I'm saying? Because if your behavior would change one bit, then guess what? Because your behavior is based on your perception of reality. And if you really did believe that God was always with you, then you wouldn't have to change your behavior just because Jesus was there in bodily form. Your behavior reflects your perception of reality. And see, there's a part of me that says, okay, on one level, I do affirm that, but on another level, my behavior doesn't demonstrate that belief. I'm not living in integrity in that area of my life. And see, this is why spiritual development, spiritual maturity is so important. Spiritual maturity, rightly understood. Spiritual maturity is more than just Bible knowledge. It's learning to see the world in a certain way. Because when you see the world in a particular way, when you see the world the way Jesus saw the world, then his priorities become my priorities. His values become my values. And then I begin to act the way he acted. Because I'm seeing the world the way he saw it. And one reason why Jesus talked so much about money is because money has a way of revealing what we really trust in. Now, in light of all that, look at verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you three things to do. Okay, these are kind of your walk away and do things. Okay, three things to do, and they're not complicated, but they won't be easy. And I'm not going to get too specific. I want you to decide some things for yourself. But here's the first thing. Most of us in this room need to find a way to tell money, you're not the boss of me. Find a way to tell money, you're not in control of my life. You're not on the throne of my life. I don't know exactly what that might look like. It might involve giving something away. It might involve choosing not to work overtime when that opportunity is presented to you because you would rather spend time with your family, or you'd rather spend time reading the Bible, or you'd rather spend time doing something else. But find a way to tell money, you're not the boss of me. Here's the second thing. Think about poor people. Think about poor people. See, it's a weird phenomenon in our world today that rich people and poor people never come into contact. Up until just recently, rich people and poor people all lived together in the same village. They walked the same roads. They saw each other on a regular basis. But now, if you're wealthy enough, you can live in a gated community. And some of these like there's a gated community near our house that has shopping and a dentist's office and a bank and everything in the neighborhood. You don't ever have to leave. It's fantastic. Except you never see poor people. Which, I mean, maybe for some people that's like the goal. I don't want to see them because kind of out of sight, out of mind, But there are poor people in our world. And you need to think about them. And one simple way to do it would be, I know for a long time we did this, and we've kind of gotten out of the habit, but we've talked about doing it for Christmas this year, sponsoring a child through either World Vision or Compassion International or something like that. And they send you a little picture of the child that you're sponsoring. And this is what we used to do back before Jill and I had kids. We sponsored a child, and we put the picture of little Severo on the refrigerator. So that anytime we went to get food, we were reminded Severo doesn't have a refrigerator in his house. And it brought that to mind. You might want to do something, you might want to do a short-term mission trip and take pictures while you're there of those people in other parts of the world who live in poverty. Think about poor people. And the last thing I would ask you to do is to simplify your life. I mean, do you really need all the stuff you have? Maybe you need to go through a process of de-accumulation, I was talking to somebody about this not too long ago, and they said that they don't need to just deaccumulate. They need to have a closet exorcism. I mean, they need somebody to come in and cast out all the demons of clutter out of their closets, you know. But just ask yourself, look at all the stuff you have. Do you really need all that stuff? I have friends whose entire garage is packed with Christmas decorations. Who needs that many Christmas decorations, for crying out? I mean, I'm all for the most wonderful time of the year and all that kind of stuff, and let's celebrate Christmas and let's do it right, and let's really go for it. But come on, all of that stuff, do you really need it? Maybe we need to simplify our lives a little bit, because the reality is what you think you possess actually comes to possess you. And can you imagine a community of people who were committed to this sort of upside-down, simple lifestyle, who said, we are grateful for what we have, and we're going to be generous to a fault. We're going to earn as much as we can, save as much as we can, and give away as much as we can. And if it is within our power, we will see to it that no person within our reach goes to bed hungry tonight. That nobody, no child wakes up on Christmas morning this year with nothing underneath the tree. That no person has to suffer without being able to read, without having drinkable water, without having the basic needs of sanitation. Can you imagine a group of people who were wholly devoted to the single-minded pursuit of life in God's kingdom, even if it meant giving stuff away? Can you imagine what a community like that would look like? Can you imagine the people who would be beating our doors down, trying to become part of that? You want to talk about changing the world? The people in this room could change the world. Jesus did it with 12. We have 10 times that many. We really have within our power the ability to change our community, to be a city set on a hill, a light on a lampstand that you couldn't hide if you tried. That really can happen here. The question is, how bad do we want it? Let's pray. God, I can't speak for everybody in this room, but me personally, I want it. I want it bad. And I don't know what you're calling people to do. I don't know exactly what you're calling me to do. But God, we have grown comfortable. And we have grown greedy, too many of us. And I'll just confess for me, I don't think I'm greedy, but I want a lot more money. And I just pray that you will break that you'll tear that out of my heart, that you will make me more generous now than I was this time last year, and that you will make me want to be even more generous than that you will enable me to earn as much as I can, you will discipline me to save as much as I can, and you will liberate me to give as much as I can, because that reflects the heart of your Son, Jesus, who came here and gave everything to people who didn't deserve it, people like me. Make us more like Jesus. That's our prayer. In Christ's name, amen. We'll see you next week.